You can give someone your loyalty, your time, your patience, even your self-worth, and still end up being treated as if you are replaceable, disposable, easily overlooked. And when that reality sets in, there is a very specific emotional chain reaction that tends to unfold almost every time. It does not happen randomly. It follows a pattern. 6 quiet internal breakdowns that slowly weaken even the most giving heart. Before going deeper into this, it is worth pausing for an honest inner check. Have you ever noticed that the more effort you poured into someone, the less important you started to feel in their presence? If that question strikes something uncomfortable within you, you are far from alone. And what follows may finally give words to something you have felt deeply, but struggled to clearly define or explain to yourself. When a person enters a relationship with a deeply giving mindset, they often offer consistent care, emotional presence, understanding, forgiveness, patience, and at times even self-neglect in order to maintain connection. Their way of loving is rooted in endurance and effort, where emotional investment becomes a form of devotion. In the early phase, a narcissistic leaning personality may respond very strongly to this kind of devotion. It can feel exciting to them, even intoxicating, because it provides attention, emotional supply, validation, and a sense of being centered. However, as time progresses, an internal shift slowly begins within the dynamic. What once felt special starts to become familiar, and what becomes familiar often begins to lose its perceived value. The giver, meanwhile, does not reduce their effort. Instead, they often increase it. They try to understand more, accommodate more, explain more, and fix more, operating under the belief that if they just love harder, things will stabilize and return to harmony. But rather than restoring balance, this growing imbalance creates a subtle psychological distortion where one side becomes the constant provider and the other becomes the constant receiver. Gradually, the emotional labor starts to disappear into the background. It is always there, always available, and because of that consistency, it stops being consciously acknowledged. At the same time, individuals with narcissistic patterns often struggle with sustained emotional reciprocity. Vulnerability that does not serve their self-image can feel threatening or uncomfortable, which may lead them to pull away emotionally, seek control, or shift toward admiration-based interactions instead of genuine mutual exchange. As a result, the steady generosity of the giver is not always reflected back in equal emotional depth. Instead of being met with shared presence, it may be met with entitlement, emotional distance, or selective engagement. The relationship gradually becomes centered around what is being received rather than what is being mutually built. Over time, the giver begins to sense this imbalance, but instead of attributing it to the dynamic itself, they often turn inward and assume it must be their own fault. This leads them to try even harder. They overextend themselves emotionally in an attempt to repair a connection that is already structurally uneven. This is how emotional exhaustion begins to replace emotional safety, slowly and almost invisibly. Love starts to feel less like mutual connection and more like continuous maintenance performed by one person alone. After the initial phase of idealization, where the giver is seen through a highly positive and admiring lens, there often comes a subtle transition. The emotional atmosphere begins to shift in a way that is not always immediately obvious. The same traits that were once praised, such as your loyalty, your warmth, your patience, your willingness to understand, may slowly begin to be reframed or interpreted in a more dismissive tone. This change is rarely dramatic at first. It often appears through small comments, slight tone changes, minor criticisms, or behavioral inconsistencies that leave you feeling slightly unsettled, but unsure whether it is serious enough to confront. What makes this stage particularly confusing is the emotional contrast with what came before. You are still mentally holding on to the earlier intensity, the feeling of being valued, chosen, and deeply appreciated. So when devaluation begins, your mind tries to reconcile two conflicting realities. You may start questioning yourself, wondering if you did something wrong, or believing that if you just adjust your behavior a little more carefully, you can bring back the earlier version of the relationship. This creates a cycle of self-monitoring, where you become increasingly cautious about your tone, your responses, your expressions, and even your emotions. At this point, criticism is often delivered in a way that does not feel openly aggressive. It may be disguised as concern, disappointment, or emotional frustration, which makes it harder to identify as emotional erosion. Over time, you begin to feel as though your natural self is either too much or not enough, depending on the moment. You start reducing parts of your personality without consciously realizing it, simply to avoid disapproval or emotional withdrawal. Internally, this creates a constant state of tension. You are still trying to regain the warmth that once felt effortless, but the conditions seem to keep changing. No matter how much you adjust, there is always another expectation, another issue, or another perceived flaw being highlighted. This ongoing instability does not just affect how you see the relationship, it slowly begins to reshape how you see yourself. Eventually, love starts to feel linked with correction rather than acceptance. When your emotional reality is repeatedly questioned in such a dynamic, a deeper psychological instability begins to form. At first, it may not look like outright denial. Instead, it often appears in subtle contradictions, dismissive responses, or reinterpretations of events that make you pause and question your own memory. You remember something clearly, but you are told it did not happen that way. You express how something felt, but you are told you are overreacting, misunderstanding, or exaggerating. Over time, this creates a growing distance between what you experienced internally and what you are being told externally is true. That gap becomes mentally exhausting. Human perception relies heavily on external feedback, especially within close relationships, to validate internal reality. When that feedback becomes inconsistent or invalidating, the natural response is to turn inward and assume the issue lies within yourself. You begin questioning your memory, your emotional intensity, your interpretation of events, even when your internal experience feels undeniably real. This is where self-doubt begins to take root, not suddenly, but gradually, like erosion over time. As it continues, you may start adjusting how you communicate. You soften your concerns, avoid certain topics, or mentally rehearse your reactions before expressing them. Not because your perception has changed, but because being told you are wrong has become emotionally draining. Eventually, you begin to rely more on the other person's version of reality than your own inner sense, even when something feels off. Your internal compass becomes less trusted. Feelings that once served as clear signals of discomfort or misalignment start to feel uncertain, as though they need external approval to be valid. Step by step, this leads to a disconnection from your own emotional clarity. You still feel things deeply, but you stop fully trusting what those feelings mean. Instead of using emotions as guidance, you begin treating them as questionable data, something to second guess rather than understand. And this deepens the confusion further, keeping you trapped in a cycle of trying to get it right within a reality that keeps subtly shifting. Emotional exhaustion in this kind of relational pattern does not appear all at once. It builds slowly through continuous invisible effort, through constant internal processing that others may never even notice, until one day you realize you have been carrying far more than you ever consciously agreed to carry. The person who has given everything often begins to function in a state of ongoing emotional labor, where they are not only handling their own internal feelings, but also constantly regulating and managing the emotional atmosphere of the relationship itself. This involves silently predicting reactions before they happen, trying to prevent disagreements from forming, quickly repairing any misunderstanding that appears, and continuously reshaping their own emotional responses so that tension does not escalate or lead to withdrawal from the other side. Over time, this becomes less of a conscious choice and more of an automatic survival pattern. Gradually, this turns into a pattern of overfunctioning, where the individual slowly assumes responsibility for emotional stability within the relationship, even when that responsibility is not equally shared or acknowledged. They may find themselves repeatedly clarifying their intentions just to be understood, offering apologies not necessarily because they are wrong, but because it restores a sense of connection, or carefully reframing situations in ways that maintain peace and prevent emotional distance. On the outside, this behavior can be mistaken for emotional maturity, patience, or deep commitment. Yet internally, it often feels like a constant monitoring of self, a state of alertness where nothing can be left unexamined. What makes this pattern especially draining is not just the effort itself, but the lack of stable resolution that follows it. Instead of reaching a secure emotional ground where things feel settled, the situation keeps shifting in unpredictable ways. What seemed to work in one moment loses its effectiveness in the next. What was considered acceptable behavior at one point suddenly becomes an issue later, without clear explanation. This inconsistency creates an emotional instability that forces the mind into continuous analysis, constantly trying to decode what version of behavior, tone, or expression will finally create consistency and safety. Over time, this ongoing mental adjustment becomes exhausting, not just emotionally, but physically as well. As this cycle continues, the mind and body begin to register a deep kind of fatigue. Emotional weight builds gradually, sometimes so subtly that it is only noticed when motivation begins to fade or when self-expression starts to feel heavier than before. The person may begin to feel increasingly disconnected from their own inner needs because the priority shifts toward maintaining harmony in the relationship at all costs. Even moments that should feel restful do not fully restore energy because part of the mind remains occupied with unresolved tension, replaying interactions, interpreting meanings, and anticipating what might come next. Rest becomes incomplete, as though the nervous system never fully powers down. Eventually, emotional exhaustion is no longer just about feeling tired or overwhelmed. It evolves into a deeper state where even simple emotional expression starts to feel like effort. Spontaneity begins to disappear, replaced by careful calculation of words and reactions. A sense of inner ease becomes harder to access, as if the emotional space within the person has narrowed over time. If this resonates even slightly, it often becomes important to pause internally and reflect on what stages of this process feel familiar in one's own lived experience. Because awareness itself begins to interrupt the automatic nature of the cycle. Awareness is not just intellectual understanding, but the first real boundary that begins to form within the self. And if there is willingness to explore further, it becomes possible to understand how detachment from this cycle can begin without forcing emotional shutdown or complete withdrawal from relationships. In many cases, what appears as emotional isolation does not begin in a dramatic or obvious way. It develops gradually, almost invisibly, making it difficult to recognize while it is happening. It rarely starts with clear instructions to disconnect from others. Instead, it begins through subtle internal shifts in attention, emotional investment, and the sense of safety experienced in external relationships. As the emotional focus of the individual becomes increasingly centered on managing the primary relationship, other areas of connection, such as friendships, family interactions, and wider social engagement, slowly begin to feel more demanding. This is not necessarily because those relationships change, but because internal emotional capacity becomes limited. When so much energy is continuously spent on understanding, repairing, and stabilizing one central emotional bond, there is naturally less energy available for other forms of connection. As a result, interactions that once felt effortless may begin to feel like obligations rather than sources of relief or enjoyment. Over time, social withdrawal can begin to form in very subtle ways. Plans may be canceled more frequently, not always due to lack of desire, but due to emotional exhaustion. Conversations may feel harder to engage in, especially when there is an internal sense of confusion that is difficult to explain. There can be an increasing tendency to avoid social interaction because it feels draining to present a normal external self, while internally carrying emotional complexity that feels unresolved. This creates a quiet separation between inner experience and outward behavior. At the same time, there are often relational dynamics that reinforce this narrowing of the social world. External relationships may start to feel less relevant, less important, or even emotionally risky. In some cases, outside connections are subtly questioned in the mind, minimized in importance, or seen as distractions from the primary emotional focus. The individual may begin to feel that others would not fully understand their situation, or that explaining it would require too much effort or even create misunderstandings. There can also be an internal sense that discussing the situation outside the relationship might feel disloyal or inappropriate, even when no one has explicitly suggested that. This creates a quiet but powerful internal justification for pulling back from social connections, even in the absence of external pressure. As this process continues, isolation becomes more structured. The relationship gradually becomes the central and sometimes only emotional reference point. This increases emotional dependency, not necessarily through force or control, but through the gradual reduction of alternative emotional inputs. Without regular external perspectives, it becomes increasingly difficult to reality check experiences or recognize patterns that might otherwise be more visible from an outside point of view. Slowly, the emotional world begins to shrink. The person may still be physically surrounded by others, but emotionally, fewer voices are influencing their sense of reality. This creates a narrowing of perspective, where the relationship begins to feel larger and more central than everything else, even when it is also the source of emotional confusion or distress. Over time, this intensified focus makes the relational dynamic feel more consuming, as if it defines the emotional climate of the entire inner world. Eventually, a final stage begins to form, and this stage often carries the most psychological weight because it represents a breaking point in the internal system the person has been trying to maintain for a long time. After repeated cycles of idealization, emotional devaluation, self-doubt, exhaustion, and withdrawal, something begins to fundamentally shift in how reality is processed. The mind reaches a point where it can no longer reconcile the amount of emotional effort being invested with the level of emotional return being received. This imbalance becomes increasingly difficult to mentally organize. This creates a rising internal pressure that eventually exceeds the system's capacity to adapt in its previous way. In some individuals, this manifests as emotional burnout, where both emotional and physical systems begin to shut down as a protective response to prolonged stress. Emotional reactions that once felt intense or immediate may begin to feel muted, distant, or less accessible. The ongoing effort to fix, repair, or stabilize the relationship begins to lose urgency, not because the situation has improved, but because the nervous system has reached a threshold where continued emotional engagement feels unsustainable. There is often a noticeable sense of numbness at this stage, which can be confusing because it does not always reflect a true absence of feeling. Instead, it reflects an overwhelmed internal system that can no longer process emotional intensity in the same way. It is as if the mind temporarily reduces sensitivity in order to protect itself from further overload. For others, the shift does not come as numbness, but as clarity. This change is often gradual rather than sudden. It appears as a slow reorganization of perception, where the same patterns that once felt confusing begin to appear more consistent and recognizable. The contradictions that previously required constant justification or emotional explanation begin to stand out more clearly. The overall dynamic starts to feel less like a mystery and more like a repeating structure that does not change significantly despite repeated effort or adjustment. At this point, what once felt like personal failure or miscommunication may begin to be understood as a consistent relational pattern that persists regardless of how much effort is invested. This recognition can be deeply destabilizing because it challenges the long-held belief that more understanding, patience, or emotional work would eventually create balance. Instead, there is often a painful realization that the imbalance was not temporary, accidental, or easily correctable, but something more structural in nature.